In this video, we look at the situation with the Amazon rainforest, apparently under threat from the policy of the unapologetic Brazilian president. And we also look at the fierce argument over rainforest in the Congo basin, where conservation led by WWF is allegedly driving violence and victimization of indigenous people. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for Changemaking. The Amazon rainforest is, let's face it, a wonder of the world and an important part of the planet. It exhales a fifth of the Earth's oxygen, as well as storing large amounts of carbon. It breathes water into air streams that then carry it to the breadbaskets of Argentina and the American Midwest. It houses 10 to 15% of the Earth's land-based biodiversity, and Brazil is home to 60% of the Amazon rainforest. Well, that's lovely. You might think, why are we talking about it right now? Well, mostly because significant parts of the rainforest are currently on fire. Now, this time of year is traditionally associated with a number of wildfires in the Amazon, but they are also started in order to illegally clear land for cattle ranching. And Brazil's National Institute for Space Research said that its satellite data showed an 83% increase on the same period last year. On the ground, the phenomenon has been making itself felt, smoke from the fires causing a blackout of Sao Paulo on Monday. And this came weeks after President Jair Bolsonaro sacked the head of the agency amid a row over its deforestation data. NASA has said that the overall fire activity in the Amazon basin slightly below average this year. Activity increased in Amazonas and Rondônia, decreased in the states of Mato Grosso and Pará. The rainforest has lost 20% of its cover to deforestation in the last 50 years, and there's evidence if too much more of it is lost, it will significantly affect the ecology of the whole area, along with knock-on effects elsewhere. President Bolsonaro is a populist who was elected last year with a promise to prioritise development over conservation. Various groups have said that forest clearance has significantly increased since his election. The areas where deforestation has been taking place are particularly lawless, and the Brazil rainforest has been rated as the most dangerous place in the world to be an environmentalist. The election of Bolsonaro is thought to have emboldened a number of people who have calculated that illegal forest clearance will not now be punished, so they can proceed with impunity. His government announced that it would relocate foreign aid away from projects to protect the rainforest and give it instead to cattle and soybean farmers. And that move led Germany and Norway, two of the biggest donors, to freeze tens of millions of dollars in planned aid. Did that bring him to heel? Well, not exactly. Unperturbed, Bolsonaro basically told Angela Merkel to mind her own business. He said he's reclaiming the Amazon for Brazilians. Quote, "We understand the importance of the Amazon for the world, but the Amazon is ours. There will not be any more of that sort of policy that we saw in the past that was terrible for everyone." And he added, "No country in the world has a moral right to talk about the Amazon. You destroyed your own ecosystems." And in that, of course, well, he does kind of have a point. Europe has seen massive deforestation historically. It's all very well for us now to be realising, well, that might have been a mistake once we've enjoyed the benefits of economic development. But even so, the world can't afford to leave it there, and as a result of that imperative, this is potentially scuppering a trade deal between Europe and South America, which would require Brazil to abide with the Paris Agreement on climate change, which calls for an end to illegal deforestation in the Amazon by 2030. Bolsonaro's more focused on the 4 years of economic stagnation Brazil has recently gone through, and he's threatening to pull out of Paris. He notoriously refused to meet with France's foreign minister to discuss the situation, opting instead to live stream himself on Facebook, getting a haircut. Ironically, if you look at the studies over 50 years of a deforestation-based development model, well, it hasn't actually resulted in better wealth creation from the Amazon. Agricultural land from the Amazon is very unproductive, and used for ranching it quickly becomes degraded and useless. As a result, it takes just a quarter of the same amount of land to produce as much value from agriculture in Sao Paulo as it does in the Amazon. However, don't expect something as inconvenient as facts to stop the land grab anytime soon. Today he followed up on the theme by alleging, without evidence, that NGOs were possibly setting fire to the Amazon themselves in revenge for cuts to their funding. Now, personally, I like to see some evidence before taking a position or a side. I think I'll just skip right ahead on that one and call it baloney right there. So that's the challenge. And hideous though it is to see those pictures of rainforest burning in the short term, the question is, how do we, as a species, actually deal with that sort of problem in the long term? We're organised around the nation state, pretty much. Nature doesn't really follow the national borders, so we can have something that's a precious asset to the whole of humanity and put it in the hands of someone who, to be fair, in common with the leaders of every other nation state, asks the question, how do we make the best of our circumstances? And, bear in mind, not everyone who asks that question asks it at the highest of intellectual levels. It's about incentives. One thing we know about the human race pretty reliably is that we follow the incentives put in front of us. And just like everyone else who cherry picks what they do or don't believe about the science of climate change, Bolsonaro is taking the version that gives him the freest hand, expressing lack of interest in climate change and the other environmental benefits of the Amazon. As far as he's concerned, it's just unproductive land. And on one level, he's right. Being warm and fuzzy about the rainforest doesn't keep people out of poverty. So if it's an important asset for the world, how do you create incentives for countries to safeguard those assets for the greater good? Reliable enough incentives that they make sense for leaders of all political persuasions. Now, obviously, in this case, the Germans and the Norwegians were funding programs, but the danger is that this can be seen as people from the outside taking control if the benefits of a program aren't well designed. We might be seeing an example of that in a different form in the number 2 great rainforest in the world, the Congo Basin. The Congo holds 8% of the world's forest-based carbon. It feeds the rainfall across the North Atlantic. One of the initiatives to preserve it is the creation of the Mesok National Park. It's being led with European funding and implemented by global conservation charity WWF. And it hasn't been having a happy time. In the last couple of days, hundreds of Baka pygmies from the Congo rainforest have written to the European Commission about their funding for the project, which they say is resulting in them being thrown off their land. WWF got European funding to go ahead with the project on the condition that the consent of indigenous peoples was obtained. WWF produced a report for the EU which confirmed that this had been done. Indigenous rights charity Survival International has been aggressively attacking WWF, suggesting that this wasn't true and that negative feedback from the tribes had been ignored. Now the park was being policed by eco-rangers who are refusing to allow the Baka, who are traditional hunter-gatherers, to access the land. They are being accused of poaching, which they say is not the case. In the letter, they say, eco-guards funded by WWF first came to our forest years and years ago. They ban us from hunting to feed our families. They ban us from entering the forest. They told us about the boundary of the park, but nobody came to ask for our consent. The forest is our home. We rely on the forest to live. But you people have stolen our forest. What are we going to do? How will we survive? We don't understand why you didn't come to us for our advice and guidance about how to protect our forest. Haven't you thought of that? If the forest is so beautiful, it's because we are here. We are the ones you should be working with. Okay, so, to be fair, that letter comes across as having been coached by Survival International, but that doesn't alter the basic case. People think pristine rainforests are wildernesses that basically thrive best without people being there at all. But that isn't necessarily the case. A number of recent studies have shown that humans have influenced the rainforest to the good for a long time, using subtle management practices such as clearing non-useful plants to favour trees and plants used for food and other products. Now, you would want to see some evidence of the Baka's boasts, because it isn't the case that just because people are indigenous, they're necessarily in tune with the environment. After all, it was the indigenous population of Easter Island that made themselves extinct by clearing their local environment of its trees. Nevertheless, You can see how the park project might make sense from a top-down bureaucrat's point of view, keeping people away because they do bad things like poaching and therefore preserve it for nature by keeping them away. Generally, though, conservation historically works best when you get people who have a stake in nature being kept in balance and whose interests can be defended in law. It might be that giving the Baka ownership rights and working with them would be more effective. And I say this acknowledging that there are always details on the ground that have to be taken into account that are not obvious from a distance. But if you look at the early history of environmental law in Britain, the very first piece of environmental legislation was a common law case known as Rylands v Fletcher. That case was made possible because two landowners were in dispute because the activities of one was causing pollution on the land of the other. And it was held in law that the person responsible for the problem needed to provide remedy to the person damaged by it. It was a case made possible by the emergence of property rights. Soon after, Britain saw the first top-down legislative measures. Parliament passed the Rivers Pollution Prevention Acts 1876 and 1893. These gave local authorities the power to prosecute polluters of the river. But the people polluting the river were in fact the local authorities. So sewage continues to be discharged into the rivers and the acts were rarely invoked. The problem was that the rivers were treated as commons, over which no individual had ownership and therefore no one had the right to go to law to remedy harm. Only when a group of unhappy anglers realised that the law actually gave riverside property owners rights to have the water come to them in a natural state did they realise that if they formed an anglers association and used it to buy a few strategically placed properties between them, they could force the polluters to stop. That's what they did, and it worked. The animal rights activists will always hate this being pointed out, but historically, one of the most effective guardians of the traditional British countryside has been the game hunters and the anglers who have an interest in keeping the conditions right to maintain healthy stocks of the birds or the fish or the other animals that they want to hunt. The challenge with preserving rainforest is that generally it belongs to the state in a number of the countries concerned. Big bureaucracies breed perverse incentives. And indigenous people, who might otherwise be seen to have a similar interest to the British game hunters to maintain the environment, don't have the sort of financial resources or knowledge of how to use law to be effective guardians, even if they were granted the rights to do so. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in Brazil right now, on the ground, violence is pretty routine for those who stand in the way of the wrong people. And the WWF project in Congo has been pretty horrifying as well. Some of those eco-guards have been reported of using violence against the tribes to the degree that WWF was forced to open an investigation and report action that was being taken against the individuals concerned. Top-down conservation projects can potentially be prone to bureaucratic, ineffective and maybe even downright bad solutions. So what's to be done? I think the starting point has to be that the old approaches of these top-down bureaucratic programs need to be rethought significantly to reshape incentives on the ground. It's not as simple as saying you should just give indigenous people property rights on the rainforest they live in, because people will eventually follow incentives, and it's highly likely that people would put incentives in front of them that would be more attractive than continuing traditional subsistence living in the forest. People who routinely romanticize the noble savage in the forest should never forget that everyone has the right to decide to embrace all of the aspects of modern society that you most despise. Now, quite possibly, you need to institute some legal structure like the British Trust, where people own an asset but have a duty to manage it on behalf of the next generation. European nations can act as a catalyst and an enabler with funding, but they should channel it into legally recognised structure that is locally driven and which is allowed to seek to exploit the benefits of the rainforest within the confines of preserving its essential nature. Now, I don't know, I'm no genius who's going to come up with the answer in the last 30 seconds of a video on YouTube. The first step is to recognise that the current model of addressing the problem is broken. Top-down, bureaucratic models create perverse incentives. We need an urgent alternative.